Welcome to Revenge Oath. Tonight, we unravel a curious case from 1958. One where a pair of broken spectacles concealed more than faulty vision. What first appeared to be a trivial accident soon revealed a calculated deception, a silent observer, and a truth that Sherlock Holmes alone could see clearly. Your comments are very important to me. Tell me where you're watching from today. Now, let us follow Holmes as he pieces together the clues and exposes the mystery behind the broken spectacles. It was upon a bitter January morning, when the fog lay thick as wool upon the streets of London, that the case first came to trouble the peace of Baker Street. The gas lamps along Marylebone Road burned like dim stars drowned in a grey firmament, and the sound of carriage wheels arrived muffled and uncertain, as though the city itself hesitated to move. Within these familiar conditions of gloom and half-light, so often the heralds of singular events, a crime was committed whose peculiarities defied ordinary explanation, and set even the most seasoned minds at Scotland Yard at a loss. The victim was Sir Lionel Harcourt, Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and one of the foremost optical physicists of his generation, a man whose studies of refraction and corrective lenses had earned him both distinction and a modest fortune. He was discovered shortly after dawn in the private study of his Bloomsbury townhouse, seated upright in his high-backed chair as though interrupted mid-thought. There were no signs of struggle. No wound could be found upon his body. Yet, Sir Lionel Harcourt was unquestionably dead. What rendered the affair baffling was not merely the absence of violence, but a single, inexplicable detail upon which all subsequent theories foundered. Lying upon the polished mahogany desk before him were Sir Lionel's spectacles, gold-rimmed, finely crafted, and unmistakably shattered. One lens had been fractured cleanly in two, the other splintered into a web of minute cracks, as though subjected to a sudden, precise force. The frame itself remained unbent and unmarred. The study was locked from the inside. These few facts, so simple in their statement, were sufficient to reduce the first investigators to silence. The door had been forced only after the butler, alarmed by his master's failure to appear for breakfast, summoned assistance. The windows were secured. The fireplace was cold. No poison was discovered in Sir Lionel's tea, nor in the decanter of sherry at his elbow. His papers lay neatly arranged, his chair pushed back no further than habit would suggest. The man had died, it seemed, of death alone. By mid-morning, the news had spread through the discreet channels by which London's professional and intellectual circles communicate their shocks. By noon, Inspector Lestrade himself stood in the study, his brows drawn together in a knot of irritation that spoke plainly of a mind confronted with contradictions it did not care to entertain. "It's the glasses, Doctor," he was heard to mutter to Watson later. "If they weren't there, I'd swear the man simply sat down and expired. But nobody breaks spectacles like that by dying quietly." The newspapers, ever eager for sensation, seized upon the more picturesque aspects of the affair. "The Bloomsbury Enigma," proclaimed one headline. "Scientist slain in locked room," declared another with less regard for proof. Speculation abounded. Had one of Sir Lionel's rivals engineered some subtle, undetectable poison? Had the old man suffered a fit and crushed his spectacles in his final agony? If so, why was there no mark upon his hands, no trace of strain upon his body? The coroner's report only deepened the mystery. Death had occurred sometime between 11 o'clock and midnight. The cause, tentatively, was recorded as cardiac failure, though the attending physician admitted under questioning that the heart bore no obvious defect. Sir Lionel had been in excellent health for a man of 62, and had dined cheerfully with a guest that very evening. That guest, inevitably, became the focus of attention. Mr. Edwin Vale, Sir Lionel's former assistant and current business partner, was a man of 35, with a reputation for brilliance marred by a tendency toward bitterness. He had left the house shortly before 11. According to his own statement, after a discussion that the servants described as heated but not uncommon, Vale freely admitted that he and Sir Lionel had quarreled over the future direction of their research, and over certain patents whose ownership was, at best, ambiguously defined. Circumstance, that faithful ally of the unimaginative, seemed eager to lay the crime at Vale's door. He stood to gain financially from Sir Lionel's death. He had argued with him on the very night in question. And yet, for all this, no mechanism could be devised by which Vale or anyone else might have entered and left that locked study without leaving some trace behind. Thus the case rested, suspended between suspicion and impossibility, until it came by a route as indirect as most of its kind to the attention of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Dr. John Watson, whose role in these affairs has so often been to observe rather than to intervene, would later remark that Holmes appeared to divine the case's significance before a single word had been spoken aloud. The Morning Post lay scattered upon the sitting-room table at Baker Street, and among its pages was a modest column recounting Sir Lionel Harcourt's demise. Holmes read it in silence, his long fingers steepled, his grey eyes sharpening with each line. "Broken spectacles," he said at last, as though addressing the fog beyond the window, rather than his companion. "Yes, that will do." Watson, accustomed though he was to such enigmatic utterances, felt a familiar stirring of anticipation. Experience had taught him that when Holmes spoke thus quietly, almost to himself, the world was on the verge of becoming a far more complicated place. Outside, the fog pressed closer to the glass, and somewhere in Bloomsbury a locked room waited patiently, guarding its secret behind a shattered lens. Holmes folded the newspaper with deliberate care and slipped it beneath the blotter, as though the printed account had already served its purpose. He rose from his chair and began pacing the length of the sitting room, his dressing gown trailing behind him like the wake of a thought too swift to be fully grasped. Watson watched him in silence, for I had long since learned that questions at such moments were not merely useless, but actively obstructive. "You find it interesting?" Watson ventured at last. "Interesting is a word I reserve for violin strings and poisons, my dear fellow," Holmes replied without pausing. "This is something altogether rarer. It is instructive." He halted abruptly before the mantelpiece and selected his pipe, filling it with the mechanical precision that always signaled intense concentration. Only when the first thin plume of smoke had curled toward the ceiling did he turn to his companion. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what do you make of Sir Lionel Harcourt?" Watson considered the question, surprised by its simplicity. A distinguished scientist, respected, apparently in good health, quarreled with his assistant, found dead in a locked room. Holmes smiled faintly, an admirable summary of what everyone makes of him, and therefore of no use at all. He leaned closer. "What did he do?" "He studied optics, lenses, spectacles." "Indeed, and relied upon them, I should think, as much as I rely upon this pipe. Now imagine, Watson, that you are a man whose livelihood and intellect depend upon precision of sight. Would you tolerate a defect in your spectacles? Certainly not. Nor would you handle them carelessly. A man may sit down and die, as Lestrade so charmingly observed, but he does not, in the process, exert a focused force sufficient to shatter hardened optical glass while leaving its gold frame unbent." Watson frowned. "Then you do not believe the spectacles were broken accidentally?" "I do not believe they were broken by death," Holmes corrected, which is a far more interesting distinction. Before Watson could reply, the landlady's measured tread sounded upon the stairs, followed by the knock that preceded the entrance of visitors of a professional sort. "Messieurs." Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, whose expression bore the marks of a man who had slept poorly and thought worse. "Morning, Mr. Holmes." "Doctor." He nodded to each in turn. "I thought I'd find you here. Your instincts are improving." "Lestrade," Holmes said pleasantly. "Pray, enlighten us. Has Sir Lionel revived?" Lestrade snorted. "If he has, he's done so without notifying the Yard." "No, but matters are pressing. Harcourt's solicitor paid me a visit an hour ago. Claims there's a document missing from the study, something of value. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A patent agreement, perhaps. Lestrade stiffened. You've heard of it? I have read the papers, Holmes replied, and I have read between them. Pray continue. The inspector drew a folded notebook from his pocket. According to the solicitor, Sir Lionel and Vale were to finalize a new arrangement. Harcourt intended to sever their partnership and sell the rights independently. The draft was prepared, signed by Harcourt, and kept in the study. It has vanished. Watson felt the case tighten like a knot. Is even more interesting than before, Holmes interjected, but no more guilty. Lestrade bristled. You've not even seen the place. True, Holmes said calmly, but I have seen men like Vale. Ambitious, resentful, impatient. Such men do not murder with delicacy. They bludgeon reputations, not lenses. Lestrade opened his mouth to retort, but Holmes had already reached for his coat. Come, Watson. The study awaits us, and I should like to make its acquaintance before the day grows stale. Bloomsbury greeted them with a chill that crept beneath even Holmes's collar. Sir Lionel's townhouse stood in a respectable terrace, its brick facade unremarkable save for the black ribbon affixed discreetly to the door-knocker. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and extinguished fire, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The study lay at the rear, exactly as the reports had described it. Holmes moved through it with reverence, like a scholar among ancient texts. He examined the door first, the lock, the hinges, then the windows. Then, without a word, he crossed to the desk. Watson watched as his friend's demeanor changed, not with excitement, but with an almost somber attentiveness. He lifted the spectacles carefully, holding them up to the light. Gold frame, he murmured. Unwarped. The fracture lines. Yes. Clean. Directional. Meaning? Lestrade asked. Meaning that force was applied deliberately and locally, Holmes replied. Not crushed. Struck. Watson glanced at the chair. Could he have stood and dropped them? Holmes shook his head. Drop spectacles from any reasonable height, and the frame bends first. Gold is obliging in that regard. Glass is not. He set the spectacles down and turned his attention to the desk surface. His fingers traced an invisible line, stopping just short of the inkstand. Notice anything? He asked Watson. Watson leaned closer. A faint scratch? 2 scratches, Holmes corrected. Parallel. As if something narrow had been placed here repeatedly. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. A weapon? Or an instrument, Holmes said. Sir Lionel's profession favored tools of precision, and precision, Lestrade, is rarely loud. He straightened suddenly and stepped back, his expression once more inscrutable. Tell me, he said lightly, has Mr. Vale been informed of this missing document? Lestrade nodded. He claims ignorance. Says he left the house furious but empty-handed. Holmes smiled. Then he speaks the truth, at least in that. As they departed the townhouse, Watson felt the familiar mixture of admiration and frustration. Holmes had seen something, many things that remained invisible to others. Yet he offered no explanation, no conclusion. Only questions, carefully arranged, like stepping stones across dark water. Behind them, the study door closed softly, the broken spectacles left upon the desk, like a riddle half-asked. And Watson knew, with the certainty born of long experience, that the most important clue had already been found, though its meaning would not be revealed until the moment Holmes deemed it unavoidable. We returned to Baker Street in thoughtful silence. Holmes wrapped once more in that inward absorption which I had learned to regard as the outward sign of his most strenuous reasoning. He neither spoke nor acknowledged my presence until we had mounted the stairs and settled again into the sitting-room, where the familiar disorder of papers and instruments seemed almost a reassurance after the austere neatness of Sir Lionel's study. Only then did Holmes seat himself, draw his knees up, and gaze fixedly at the opposite wall, as though the answer to the riddle were written there in sympathetic ink. You are wondering why I did not press Vale more closely, he said at last, without turning his head. I confess that I am. I replied. Circumstance still points strongly toward him. The quarrel, the missing document. Circumstance, Holmes interrupted softly, is the most treacherous of guides. It flatters the lazy and betrays the diligent. Vale is angry, ambitious, and wronged quite possibly all three. But anger does not shatter glass with elegance. He rose and crossed to the window, peering down at the street where the fog had begun to thin, revealing passers-by like figures emerging from half-forgotten dreams. No, Watson. Vale's chief fault is that he wishes us to think him capable of the crime. That is the mistake of the intelligent criminal. He cannot resist appearing significant. That afternoon brought fresh fuel to the fire of suspicion. A note arrived from Lestrade, brief and emphatic, requesting Holmes's presence at Scotland Yard. A development, he wrote, had arisen concerning Mr. Vale's movements on the night of Sir Lionel's death. We found the inspector in a state of barely contained triumph. We've got him in a lie, he announced as soon as we were shown in. Vale claimed he went straight home after leaving Harcourt's house. But a cabman's come forward. Says he picked Vale up near Russell Square just after 11 and drove him east toward the river. Which proves, Holmes asked mildly, that he wasn't where he said he was. And therefore was everywhere else, Holmes replied. A most impressive deduction. Lestrade scowled. He could have gone back, found a way in. The study door was locked from the inside. Yes, but there are ways. Duplicate keys. Tricks. Indeed, Holmes said. Name one that leaves no mark, creates no sound, and requires the murderer to exit a room he has locked himself into. Lestrade fell silent, but only briefly. There's more. Vale's rooms were searched this morning. We found a small metal instrument, optical tool of some sort. Narrow, would fit those scratches you noticed on the desk. Holmes's interest sharpened at once. May I see it? The tool was produced, a slender steel rod with a flattened tip, polished smooth by use. Holmes weighed it in his hand, turning it so that the light caught its surface. A lens adjuster, he said. Common enough. Any optician would own one. Any physicist, certainly. But Vale had one, Lestrade insisted. So would Sir Lionel, Holmes replied, handing the instrument back. And so would half a dozen men who visited that study in the past month. Lestrade's face darkened. You're determined to clear him. I am determined, Holmes said quietly. We left the yard with no further progress made, at least, none that Lestrade would acknowledge. Yet Holmes's mood, far from being frustrated, appeared almost buoyant. He stopped twice on the walk home, once to examine a shop window displaying scientific instruments, and again to speak briefly with a street vendor whose wares included reading glasses of the cheapest sort. That evening, Holmes requested that I join him in reviewing Sir Lionel's published papers. For hours we sat amid journals and monographs, Holmes skimming at impossible speed while I struggled to follow the dense technical language. At length, he selected one slim volume and tapped its margin with a finger. Here, he said, this is where the trail begins. I leaned closer. It's an article on visual fatigue. On corrective overuse, Holmes corrected. Sir Lionel argued that prolonged reliance upon improperly calibrated lenses could induce not merely discomfort, but neurological shock. I stared at him. You mean his own spectacles could have harmed him? Harmed, no, Holmes said. But used improperly, altered subtly, they could become something else entirely. The thought sent a chill through me. You believe the spectacles were the weapon? I believe, Holmes replied, that they were the means. Before I could press him further, there came a sharp rap at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, severe-looking woman dressed in mourning black. She introduced herself as Miss Eleanor Harcourt, Sir Lionel's niece and sole remaining relative. Her grief was evident, but controlled. I was told you were assisting the police, she said. I hoped you might also assist me. My uncle was not a careless man, Mr. Holmes. yet they speak of his death as though it were some accident of age." Holmes inclined his head. "Your uncle was neither careless nor unlucky, Miss Harcourt. May I ask, did he ever complain of discomfort when using his spectacles?" She hesitated. "In the last week, yes. He mentioned headaches, dizziness. He blamed his work." Holmes's eyes flicked briefly to mine. "And who adjusted his spectacles most recently?" Miss Harcourt answered without hesitation. "Mr. Vale. They argued about it, in fact. My uncle accused him of tampering." There was a pause, heavy with implication. Yet Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Thank you," he said gently. "You have been most helpful." After she had gone, I turned to him. "Surely this points back to Vale." "It points," Holmes said slowly, "to the last man we are meant to suspect." He reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings in a low, thoughtful note that vibrated through the room. "The hand that breaks the spectacles is not always the hand that sets the trap, Watson. And the most dangerous crimes are those committed under the guise of professional intimacy." He played on, softly, while the fog closed in once more upon Baker Street, and I sensed that we were approaching the heart of the mystery, though its true shape remained. For the moment, just beyond the reach of sight. Holmes played long after night had settled fully upon Baker Street, the lamplight throwing his angular shadow against the wall in exaggerated form. I did not interrupt him, for I recognized the music as the outward sign of a mind assembling its conclusions with care. When at last he set the violin aside, it was with a decisive motion, as though some internal balance had been struck. "Watson," he said, "we must look beyond the obvious circle. Sir Lionel's study was not merely a place of work, it was a crossroads." "A crossroads?" I echoed. "Of intellects," Holmes replied. "Men of science, patrons, rivals, and most importantly those who stood to gain not from his death alone, but from the manner of it." The following morning brought us again to Bloomsbury, though this time Holmes did not head directly for the townhouse. Instead, he led me a few streets away to a modest consulting room above a chemist's shop. A brass plate by the door bore the name Mr. Arthur Bellamy, consulting optician. Bellamy proved to be a nervous little man, with ink-stained fingers and a manner perpetually apologetic. At the sight of Holmes, however, his anxiety sharpened into something closer to fear. I read about Sir Lionel," he said, wringing his hands. "A terrible business." "Indeed," Holmes said. "You were acquainted with him." "Professionally only. He consulted me from time to time. Specialists do that, you know. Second opinions." "Quite so," Holmes replied. "And did you provide one recently?" Bellamy hesitated. I adjusted a pair of spectacles for him last week, at his request." I glanced at Holmes. "Adjusted in what way?" Bellamy swallowed. "The lenses. He believed there was an error in their calibration, that they were inducing strain." Holmes leaned forward. "And were they?" Bellamy hesitated again, longer this time. "They were modified, Mr. Holmes. Subtly. Enough that prolonged use could disorient. I told him so." "Did you tell anyone else?" Holmes asked. Bellamy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Sir Lionel asked for discretion. He suspected foul play." Holmes straightened. "And did you, Mr. Bellamy, alter the spectacles further?" "Certainly not. I restored them as best I could and advised him not to wear them until new lenses could be ground. And yet," Holmes said softly, "he wore them." Bellamy looked away. He was stubborn. Brilliant men often are. Outside, Holmes drew a deep breath of the cold air. "That confirms one point," he said. "Sir Lionel was already under assault, though he did not yet know by whom." "But if Vale altered the spectacles," I began. "Then Vale did so clumsily," Holmes replied. "Too directly. Sir Lionel noticed, complained, sought a second opinion. The true culprit would never have allowed that." We were scarcely back at Baker Street when Lestrade arrived, this time without his usual bluster. His expression was troubled. "There's been another incident," he said. "Not a death, but close enough to raise concern. One of Harcourt's colleagues, Professor James Alderton, collapsed last night. Severe vertigo. Temporary blindness." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Spectacles?" Lestrade nodded grimly. "Yes. Recently adjusted. By Vale, as it happens." I saw Lestrade's relief at having his suspect reinforced, but Holmes's face darkened. "Where is Alderton now?" "At Street Bartholomew's. Conscious, but shaken." Holmes was already reaching for his hat. "Then we shall speak with him at once." Professor Alderton was a gaunt man with sharp features and restless hands. He described a sudden distortion of vision, lights bending unnaturally, followed by nausea and collapse. "It felt," he said faintly, "as though the world had tilted." "Did you notice anything unusual about your spectacles beforehand?" Holmes asked. "They were returned to me with an apology," Alderton replied. "Vale," said Sir Lionel, had borrowed them for comparison. Holmes nodded, satisfied. "And Sir Lionel returned them himself?" "No. They arrived by post." As we left the hospital, Holmes's pace slowed, his thoughts evidently turning inward once more. "It is a chain," he said. "Each link designed to implicate Vale, each alteration just noticeable enough to provoke complaint, yet dangerous enough to cause harm." "But Sir Lionel died," I said. "Others did not." "Because Sir Lionel," Holmes replied, "was the final experiment." That evening, Holmes sent several telegrams. To Bellamy, to Alderton, to a name I did not recognize, Mr. Frederick Merton, a patron of scientific enterprises. When I asked him about it, he merely smiled. "Every man leaves fingerprints, Watson, some upon glass, others upon money." The next day brought the missing document back into play. Lestrade informed us that it had been discovered not in Vale's rooms, but lodged behind a loose panel in Sir Lionel's study. "Planted," Holmes murmured, "and poorly." Lestrade's patience was fraying. "Then who?" Holmes did not answer him directly. Instead, he asked a question of his own. Who stood to gain if Vale were ruined? Lestrade frowned. "Any number of rivals." "Or patrons," Holmes added. "Men who fund genius and resent independence." That afternoon, Frederick Merton arrived at Baker Street. He was a polished man, impeccably dressed, his confidence worn like armor. "I understand you wish to see me," he said smoothly. "I did," Holmes replied. "You funded Sir Lionel's work for several years, until he grew difficult, and sought to sever your arrangement," Holmes said, "leaving you without claim to his latest discoveries." Merton smiled thinly. "Business disagreements are hardly murder." "No," Holmes agreed. "But they are motive." Merton's eyes flicked, just once, toward the violin on the table. Holmes leaned back. "You arranged for Vale to appear responsible. You encouraged his adjustments. You ensured Sir Lionel continued to wear compromised lenses. You counted on the effect being gradual." Merton laughed softly. "You have no proof." Holmes's voice hardened. "You miscalculated. Sir Lionel noticed too much, too soon. He confronted Vale. He sought Bellamy. So you accelerated the process, ensuring he wore the spectacles one final time." Merton rose. "This is absurd." Holmes rang the bell. Lestrade entered from the adjoining room, warrant in hand. "The final miscalculation," Holmes said quietly, "was breaking the spectacles. You wished them to appear violently damaged, but you forgot one thing." Merton hesitated. "A man who collapses from neurological shock does not clench his fists." Silence fell heavy as fog. And in that silence, I knew the trap had closed not with force, but with the inexorable precision of truth at last brought into focus. Merton's composure did not collapse at once. It fractured, much like the spectacles that had betrayed him. He stood rigidly, his lips drawn into a thin line, his eyes moving from Holmes to Lestrade and back again, with the calculation of a man measuring the last inches of ground before a fall. "This is conjecture," he said at last. "Elegant conjecture, I grant you, but still, nothing more." Holmes regarded him with a look of almost scholarly regret. "Conjecture, Mr. Merton, is the scaffold upon which proof is built, and your difficulty lies in the fact that the scaffold has already been removed." Lestrade stepped forward. "You'll come with us, sir." Merton allowed himself to be escorted from the room without resistance. Yet even as the door closed behind him, I sensed that Holmes was not yet satisfied. There was no triumph in his expression, only concentration, sharpened now to its finest edge. "You think he will attempt to escape?" I said quietly. "I think," Holmes replied, "that a man who has invested so much ingenuity in misdirection will not surrender his freedom without one final maneuver." My words were scarcely spoken when a commotion arose in the street below. We hurried to the window to see a small crowd gathered near the corner, a constable kneeling beside a fallen man. Lestrade's voice rose in sharp command. Holmes's jaw tightened. Too late. We descended at once. Frederick Merton lay upon the pavement, unconscious but breathing, his face bloodless, his right hand clenched around a small glass vial, now shattered. "Poison," Lestrade muttered. "Poor quality," Holmes said, examining the fragments. "Enough to incapacitate, not to kill. He feared interrogation more than death, but not quite enough to embrace the latter fully." Merton was conveyed under guard to the infirmary wing of the yard, where he would recover under watchful eyes. The attempt, feeble though it was, served only to confirm Holmes's accusation in Lestrade's mind, though the inspector would never admit how close he had come to letting the true culprit slip through his grasp. The days that followed were a study in quiet unraveling. Vale was formally cleared, though the stain upon his reputation would take longer to fade. Professor Alderton recovered fully and provided testimony regarding the returned spectacles and their peculiar distortion. Bellamy's account was entered into record. Piece by piece, the structure Holmes had glimpsed from the beginning became visible to all. Yet it was only when the trial loomed that Holmes consented to lay the full logic of the case before me. We sat late one evening by the fire, the city unusually still beyond the windows. "You see, Watson," he began, "the crime was never intended as a murder. It was intended as a failure. Merton wished Sir Lionel. Discredited, declared unstable, perhaps incapacitated, dependent. A brilliant man made unreliable by his own instruments. And when that failed, then expedience took over. The alterations to the spectacles were increased incrementally enough to provoke neurological shock. Sir Lionel's death was the final, unintended consequence." "But the broken spectacles?" I pressed. Holmes smiled faintly. "That was the flourish. Merton broke them after the fact, to suggest violence, to draw attention away from subtlety. He counted on investigators seeking a hand that struck, not a mind that adjusted." I nodded slowly. "And the locked room?" "A courtesy," Holmes said. "Sir Lionel habitually locked his study when working. Merton relied on routine. The simplest locks are habits. At the trial, Merton's defense collapsed under the weight of evidence and motive alike. He was convicted not of murder, but of manslaughter and criminal conspiracy, a distinction Holmes accepted with equanimity. "Justice," he remarked afterward, "is a lens ground by human hands. It rarely achieves perfect focus." In the quiet weeks that followed, Baker Street returned to its familiar rhythms. Holmes resumed his chemical experiments. I returned to my practice. Yet I found myself thinking often of Sir Lionel Harcourt, of a man undone not by ignorance, but by trust misplaced. One evening, as Holmes adjusted his own spectacles before reading, I could not help but remark upon the irony. He glanced at me, amused. "You need not fear, Watson. I adjust my own lenses." "And if you did not?" Holmes removed them and set them carefully aside. Then I should hope, he said, that someone would notice when the world no longer looked quite right. Outside, the fog lifted, revealing the street in crisp clarity. Another mystery had passed into history, its truth restored not by force or confession, but by the patient alignment of fact and reason. And as Holmes turned the page and the fire crackled softly, I reflected once more upon the peculiar privilege of witnessing such minds at work, seeing, through broken spectacles and shattered lies alike, the hidden order that others so easily miss. Though the machinery of the law had begun its steady turning, Holmes showed no inclination to consider the matter closed. I observed this first in small signs, the way he reread the trial transcripts with the same scrutiny he once reserved for chemical formulae, or how he lingered over Bellamy's testimony as though some cadence in the words disturbed him. It was 3 evenings after Merton's collapse that he voiced his disquiet. "The pattern is complete," he said, gazing into the fire, "and yet it lacks symmetry." I looked up from my chair. "The motive, the means, the misdirection, all are accounted for." "Indeed, and that is precisely the problem," Holmes replied. "Crimes of this sort, Watson, are rarely so economical. Merton was clever, but not original. He borrowed methods." "From where?" Holmes's fingers drummed lightly upon the arm of his chair. "From Sir Lionel himself." He rose and crossed to the escritoire, extracting a notebook he had taken from the Harcourt study with Lestrade's permission. It contained Sir Lionel's private observations, drafts, marginalia, half-formed hypotheses. "Look here," Holmes said, handing it to me. "These are not the notes of a man unaware of danger. They are the notes of one preparing for it." I read aloud a passage, written in a hurried hand. "If distortion is introduced gradually, the subject adapts until collapse becomes inevitable." "You think Sir Lionel suspected an attempt on his life?" "I think he suspected an attempt on his work," Holmes replied, "and that he intended to turn the tables. The notion startled me." "You mean he allowed himself to be exposed?" Holmes's expression softened. "Not fatally. He misjudged the timing." Over the following days, Holmes reconstructed Sir Lionel's final week with painstaking care. He interviewed servants again, revisited correspondence, and even retraced Sir Lionel's walks through Bloomsbury. From these fragments emerged a subtler picture. Sir Lionel had begun wearing the altered spectacles deliberately, recording his symptoms with scientific detachment. He had planned to confront his patron with proof. Merton accelerated the experiment, Holmes concluded. He could not allow Sir Lionel to reach the end of his own reasoning. This new understanding lent the case a somber gravity. Sir Lionel had died not merely as a victim, but as a man who underestimated the ruthlessness of those who profit from intellect without possessing it. One afternoon, Miss Eleanor Harcourt returned to Baker Street. She carried herself with more composure now, though grief still traced her features. "I wished to thank you," she said, "and to ask, did my uncle suffer?" Holmes answered with unusual gentleness, briefly and knowingly. He understood, at the end, that he had been right. She nodded, satisfied, and produced a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "These were among his effects. He intended them for you, should anything happen." Inside lay a pair of spectacles, plain, steel-rimmed, unremarkable. Holmes examined them closely. "Perfectly calibrated," he murmured. "For observation, not correction." After she left, Holmes placed them beside the broken pair we still kept as reference. "Two lenses," he said. "One that clarifies the world, and one that distorts it. The difference lies not in the glass, but in the hand that shapes it." Lestrade visited later that week, bringing confirmation that Merton had begun to talk less from remorse than from the realization that silence no longer served him. There were others, minor accomplices. Clerks, intermediaries, men who adjusted schedules and parcels, all believing themselves engaged in harmless manipulation. "No one likes to think himself a murderer," Holmes remarked. "They prefer the comfort of abstraction." As winter loosened its grip on London, The case receded into memory, yet its lessons lingered. I found myself more attentive to small inconsistencies, more cautious of explanations that arrived too readily. Holmes, for his part, seemed content to let the matter rest at last. One evening, as we sat in companionable silence, he adjusted Sir Lionel's gifted spectacles upon his nose and looked toward the window. "Remarkable clarity," he said. "And what do you see?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "The same as always, Watson. A world eager to be misunderstood." He removed the spectacles and set them aside, reaching instead for his violin. As the first notes filled the room, I reflected that while crimes may be solved and culprits unmasked, the deeper struggle between truth and distortion remained eternal. And it was in that struggle, more than in any single victory, that Sherlock Holmes found his enduring purpose. For a time, it seemed as though the affair of Sir Lionel Harcourt had truly reached its natural conclusion. Holmes played his violin with renewed lightness, and the papers upon his desk gradually gave way to other, lesser curiosities. Yet I have learned, through long association, that when Holmes grows quiet rather than idle, some unresolved filament of a case still tugs at his mind. It was on a damp afternoon, when the rain traced thin, wavering lines upon the windows, that he broke a silence which had endured for nearly an hour. "Watson," he said, without looking up from his microscope, "have you ever considered how rarely a crime ends precisely where we believe it does?" "I imagine that most do," I replied. "Once the culprit is convicted." Holmes gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Convicted men are merely those whose stories have ceased to interest the law. The truth, however, is less easily satisfied." He straightened and turned the instrument toward me. "Observe this." I peered into the lens and saw a fragment of glass, scarcely larger than a fingernail, its edge jagged but its surface unnaturally smooth. "A shard from Sir Lionel's spectacles," I said. "From the wrong lens," Holmes corrected. The shattered lens on the desk was not the one he habitually used for reading. That caught my attention at once. "How can you be sure?" Holmes reached for Sir Lionel's notebook and opened it to a page dense with annotations. He notes here a slight imbalance, his right eye requiring stronger correction, yet the most severe fracturing occurred on the left lens. "Then the spectacles were broken while not being worn." "Precisely," Holmes said. "Which means the dramatic violence was staged after Sir Lionel had already collapsed." I felt a familiar chill. "But Merton wished to disguise method, not refine it," Holmes replied. "He broke the spectacles crudely. Too crudely. He wanted attention diverted, not accuracy preserved." "And yet," I said slowly, "you sound as though someone else troubles you." Holmes smiled thinly. "Because someone else should." That evening brought confirmation of his unease. Lestrade arrived with news that one of Merton's minor accomplices, a clerk named Howard Finch, had been found dead in his lodgings. Officially, it was ruled an accident, a fall down the stairs after excessive drink. Holmes's reaction was immediate. "Did Finch drink?" "Not to excess," Lestrade admitted, but the coroner was satisfied. Holmes's eyes hardened. Then the coroner was convenient. Within the hour, Holmes had obtained permission to examine the scene. Finch's rooms were cramped and poorly lit, but Holmes moved through them with the same methodical care he had shown in Bloomsbury. He examined the stairwell, the banister, the pattern of scuffs upon the steps. "A fall, yes," he said, "but not an accidental one." "You think Finch was silenced?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that Merton was not the apex of this scheme, but its most visible node." We returned to Baker Street under a gathering dusk. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent, his expression grave. "Sir Lionel threatened more than one interest," he said at last. "His research promised independence not merely from Merton, but from an entire network of patrons who profit by controlling innovation." "And Finch?" "A courier of secrets," Holmes said. "Too many, and too late." The next morning, Holmes received an unsigned letter, delivered by hand. Its contents were brief and ominous. You see clearly. Take care that clarity does not become blindness. Holmes read it twice, then burned it without comment. I could not restrain myself. This goes beyond the original crime. Of course it does, Holmes replied calmly. That is why it is dangerous. Over the following days, subtle pressures made themselves felt. Holmes' inquiries met with polite obstruction. Appointments were delayed. Witnesses recanted or fell silent. Even Lestrade, loyal though he was, found himself constrained by orders from above. They want it finished, he admitted. Holmes nodded. And so they shall have it on their terms, not mine. One night, as Holmes worked late by lamplight, I noticed him adjusting Sir Lionel's steel-rimmed spectacles once more. He studied a ledger he had acquired from Finch's effects, its columns filled with coded entries. What do they show? I asked. Payments, Holmes said. Not bribes exactly. Investments, the sort that ensure silence. And will you expose them? Holmes removed the spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Exposure is a blunt instrument. Precision is required. The following afternoon, Holmes paid a visit without announcement to the offices of a powerful scientific trust whose name had surfaced repeatedly in Finch's ledger. He returned hours later, pale but resolute. They will not pursue me openly, he said. That would draw attention. Instead, they will rely on omission. And you, I shall rely on memory. In the weeks that followed, articles appeared quietly in academic journals, challenging certain funding practices. Discreet warnings circulated among independent researchers. Holmes did not sign his name to any of it, yet his influence was unmistakable. As for Sir Lionel Harcourt, his final paper was published posthumously, its conclusions intact and unaltered. The world would benefit from his clarity, though it would never know the cost. One evening, as Holmes and I stood by the window watching the city settle into night, I remarked upon the strange turn the case had taken. It began with broken spectacles, I said, and ended with unseen hands. Holmes smiled faintly. The most effective distortions are those that leave no visible fracture, Watson. And does that trouble you? He considered the question carefully. It reminds me why vigilance must never rest. One solved crime does not guarantee a corrected world. He reached for his violin, but paused before playing. Remember this, he said. Truth, like vision, depends not only upon what is seen, but upon who controls the lens. As the music rose, steady and reflective, I sensed that while this chapter had drawn to a close, its shadow would linger. Another testament to the quiet wars waged beyond the reach of courts and headlines, where reason itself must serve as both shield and sword. The warning had been delivered, the ripples set in motion, and yet the surface of daily life at Baker Street soon resumed its customary calm. Holmes, however, was not deceived by appearances. I noticed that he varied his routines slightly, choosing different routes on his walks, glancing more often than usual at reflections in shop windows, pausing before opening correspondence. These were not the habits of fear, but of prudence, and they told me that the case of the broken spectacles had not yet released its final hold upon him. One evening, as we dined quietly, Holmes laid his knife and fork aside with deliberate care. "Watson," he said, "we are approaching the moment when events resolve themselves not by action, but by inevitability." I raised an eyebrow. "You expect another move?" "Not from those who believe they have won," Holmes replied. He rose and retrieved the ledger Finch had kept, its cipher now fully unraveled. Holmes had committed the names and figures to memory, then burned the book page by page, watching until the last ash cooled. "Evidence," he said softly, "is useful only so long as one controls its interpretation." The following day brought the final tremor. A notice appeared in the Times, buried among the financial columns. The dissolution of the scientific trust Holmes had visited, its assets redistributed amid quiet controversy. No explanation was offered, but the phrasing spoke volumes to those who knew how to read it. "They have cut loose their weakest limb," Holmes observed. "Self-preservation masquerading as reform." "And the others?" I asked. "Will be more cautious," he said. "Which, for the moment, is victory enough." Lestrade confirmed as much when he called later that week. Finch's death would remain officially accidental. No further inquiries would be pursued. The Yard, he admitted with some bitterness, had been instructed to consider the matter closed. Holmes listened without comment, then thanked him for his candor. Afterward, I could not help but voice my frustration. Holmes shook his head. "They endure. Escape would imply freedom." Spring came early that year, and with it a subtle lifting of the city's mood. Holmes seemed content to let the currents settle. He declined new cases, save for one minor affair involving a misdirected inheritance, which he resolved in a single afternoon. His thoughts, however, often returned to Sir Lionel. One morning, Holmes asked me to accompany him to Highgate Cemetery. We stood before Sir Lionel's grave in companionable silence, the stone newly set. Its inscription modest. "A fitting end," I said. "A fitting pause," Holmes replied. "Men like Harcourt do not truly end. They alter the trajectory." As we turned to leave, Holmes paused and adjusted the steel-rimmed spectacles upon his nose, surveying the rows of monuments with an expression of quiet contemplation. "Sir Lionel understood something fundamental," he said. "That knowledge is most dangerous, not when it is radical, but when it is independent." Weeks passed. The threat receded. Holmes resumed his old habits, though I sensed that something within him had been subtly recalibrated. The world, to his eyes, had always been flawed, but now he saw more clearly the mechanisms by which those flaws were maintained. One evening, as we sat by the fire, I asked him whether he regretted not forcing a greater reckoning. "Regret is a luxury," Holmes replied. "I prefer accuracy." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The lesson of this case, Watson, is not that evil triumphs when good men fail to act. It is that evil adapts when exposed, and that vigilance must adapt in turn." "And will you continue to watch?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. The last loose end resolved itself quietly. Miss Harcourt wrote to inform us that Sir Lionel's posthumous paper had sparked renewed debate in scientific circles, free from the influence that had once constrained it. She enclosed a clipping, an editorial praising the work's clarity and independence. Holmes read it once, then handed it to me. "There," he said, "a corrected lens." As night fell, he took up his violin once more. The melody he played was reflective, tinged with melancholy, but underpinned by resolve. I realized then that the case of the broken spectacles had done more than expose a crime. It had reaffirmed Holmes's peculiar role in the world, not merely as a solver of puzzles, but as a quiet guardian of intellectual honesty. When the final note faded, Holmes set the violin aside and rose. "Another case tomorrow, perhaps," he said lightly. "Or perhaps not." He moved toward the window, gazing out at the lamplit street where London carried on, unaware of the distortions corrected in its midst. For myself, I felt once again that familiar gratitude for the privilege of witnessing such clarity of mind, and for the reminder that even when truth cannot be fully enforced, it can still be defended. And so the matter of Sir Lionel Harcourt passed into the annals of my friend's career. A case not marked by spectacle or sensation, but by broken glass and steady reason. Proof that sometimes the most vital victories are those that restore our ability to see. In the days that followed, I believed the case had finally loosened its grip upon Holmes. He accepted a handful of routine consultations, indulged Mrs. Hudson's insistence upon proper meals, and even accompanied me to a modest concert, though he departed before the final movement, pleading a sudden headache brought on by imprecise violins. Yet beneath this return to normality, I sensed a quiet vigilance, like a watchman who rests with one eye open. It was a letter, delivered without flourish, that brought matters once more into sharp relief. The envelope bore no mark save a faint embossing, its paper of a quality seldom wasted on trivial correspondence. Holmes slit it open with a practiced hand and read its contents in silence. When he finished, he passed it to me. It was unsigned, written in an elegant but impersonal script. You have altered the balance. The adjustment will not be forgotten. No threat, no demand, merely an observation. Holmes folded the letter and placed it beside the ashes of the ledger he had burned weeks before. Acknowledgement, he said. Nothing more. And nothing less, I replied. He nodded. Precisely. That same afternoon, a visitor arrived at Baker Street whose presence, though polite, carried an unmistakable weight. Sir Reginald Fenton, Under-Secretary to the Home Office, was a man whose genial manner barely concealed the authority of his position. He spoke at length of civic duty, of the delicate interplay between innovation and stability, and of the importance of discretion. At last, he reached his point. There are times, Mr. Holmes, he said, when too much clarity can prove disruptive. Holmes regarded him steadily. I find that disruption is usually the result of prior distortion. Sir Reginald smiled thinly. You have made your views known. Let us hope they need not be reiterated. After he had gone, I turned to Holmes. A boundary, Holmes replied. One they hope I shall respect. And will you? Holmes considered this. I already have by not stepping beyond what is necessary. That evening, as twilight settled over London, Holmes took from his desk the steel-rimmed spectacles Sir Lionel had bequeathed to him. He held them up to the fading light, examining them one last time before placing them carefully in a drawer. They served their purpose, he said. No need to wear them further. Over the next week, subtle confirmations arrived. The scientific trust's dissolution held. Funding patterns shifted. Independent laboratories received unexpected endowments. It was as though an invisible correction had been applied to the machinery of influence, minor, precise, and irreversible. Yet Holmes did not deceive himself into believing the world transformed. Consider it a refraction, not a revolution, he remarked. Light bends, but it does not change its nature. One rainy evening, as we sat reviewing old cases, I ventured to ask him whether he felt satisfaction in this outcome. Satisfaction, Holmes said slowly, is the enemy of vigilance. And have you found it? He looked toward the window where the rain distorted the lamplight into wavering halos. In part. Enough to move on. It was then that Holmes did something I had never before seen him do. He took from a locked drawer a small collection of mementos, objects tied to cases that had shaped him more than most. A tarnished ring, a scrap of coded paper, and now a fragment of shattered lens, carefully wrapped. He placed the shard upon the table between us. This, he said, is the danger of expertise without ethics. Precision divorced from responsibility. I studied the fragment. And the remedy? Holmes smiled faintly. Persistent inquiry. The following morning brought a new case to our door, an agitated client with a problem of stolen correspondence and false identities. Holmes listened with courteous attention, his mind already engaging with fresh complexities. As the man departed, reassured, Holmes turned to me with renewed animation. Come, Watson, he said. The world insists upon its riddles. As we prepared to leave, I glanced once more at the drawer where Sir Lionel's spectacles lay hidden. Will you ever use them again? I asked. Holmes paused. Perhaps, when the world grows indistinct. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets washed clean and reflective. London moved forward, imperfect yet illuminated, its truths bent and straightened by unseen hands. As we set off toward our next engagement, I reflected that the case of the broken spectacles had ended not with applause or acclaim, but with something rarer, a quiet recalibration of forces, achieved through intellect and restraint. And I understood then that Sherlock Holmes's greatest triumphs were not those that filled the newspapers, but those that altered the unseen angles of power, restoring, however briefly, the clarity by which honest men might see their way forward. The new case Holmes had accepted unfolded with gratifying simplicity, and within a fortnight it was dispatched with a neatness that contrasted sharply with the lingering complexities of the Harcourt affair. Yet I observed that, even as Holmes applied himself to fresh puzzles, his thoughts returned from time to time to that earlier matter not with doubt, but with a kind of philosophical reckoning. One evening, after our client had departed in high spirits and Mrs. Hudson had cleared away the tea-things, Holmes remained standing by the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back. "Watson," he said thoughtfully, "do you recall the very first observation I made when we read of Sir Lionel's death?" "You spoke of the spectacles," I replied, "of their improbability." Holmes nodded. "Yes, a small inconsistency, almost trivial, and yet it opened a path that led us far beyond a single locked room." He seated himself at last and leaned forward. "It is always thus. The greatest deceptions depend upon our willingness to accept what appears complete. In this case," I said, "even the solution proved incomplete." Holmes's eyes flickered with approval. "An excellent way of putting it." The law was satisfied. Society was reassured. Yet the deeper structure, the one that allowed such a crime to be conceived, remained largely intact. "And you accept that?" "I acknowledge it," Holmes replied. "Acceptance implies approval." There was a pause, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock. Outside, the city murmured in its sleep. "You know," Holmes continued, "many imagine that my work is concerned with justice. It is not. Justice is a social construct, administered unevenly and often too late." "And what then is your concern?" I asked. "Accuracy," he said simply, "to see a thing as it is, rather than as it is presented." He reached once more for the violin, but did not play. Instead, he turned it absently in his hands. "Sir Lionel Harcourt," he went on, "saw clearly in his field, yet underestimated the distortions introduced by human ambition. That miscalculation cost him his life." I could not suppress a note of bitterness. "And the men who engineered it continue on, chastened but intact." Holmes regarded me steadily. "For now, but ideas once released are difficult to contain. Harcourt's work will outlive them." The following days confirmed this quiet optimism. Letters arrived from distant universities, seeking Holmes' opinion on Harcourt's theories. Independent researchers wrote to Miss Harcourt, requesting access to her uncle's papers. The conversation he had begun continued, freer now than before. One morning, as Holmes sorted through the correspondence, he paused and handed me a letter. "It seems Sir Lionel has the last word after all," he said. I read it with interest. It was from a young physicist in Edinburgh, crediting Harcourt's work with enabling a breakthrough in visual diagnostics. Holmes smiled faintly. A fitting legacy. As spring deepened into early summer, Baker Street grew brighter, the fog retreating to memory. Holmes appeared lighter in spirit than I had seen him in some time. The steel-rimmed spectacles remained untouched in their drawer, no longer required as a reminder. It was on a clear morning, some weeks later, that Holmes finally spoke the words I had sensed forming for days. "The case is finished," he said. "Only now?" I asked. "Only now," he replied. "A case concludes, not when the culprit is named, but when its consequences have run their course." He stood at the window, watching the street below, where life proceeded with its usual indifference to the hidden dramas that shape it. "There is a temptation, Watson," he continued, "to believe that exposure alone is sufficient, that if truth is revealed, correction must follow." "And you disagree?" "I believe truth requires guardians," Holmes said. "And guardians must know when to speak and when to let events mature." He turned from the window and met my gaze. "Had we pressed further, named every hand, challenged every influence we should have provoked resistance strong enough to undo what little good was achieved. So restraint was part of the solution. An essential part, Holmes agreed. Precision, once again. That afternoon, we took a long walk through Regent's Park. Holmes spoke little, but his silence was companionable rather than distant. At last, as we turned back toward Baker Street, I asked him a question that had long troubled me. "Do you ever tire of seeing so clearly?" He considered this carefully. "No, but I tire of others refusing to look." As we approached home, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, waving a letter with uncharacteristic excitement. "For you, Mr. Holmes. A gentleman just delivered it." Holmes opened it, glanced at the contents, and chuckled softly. "A new case?" "An invitation," he replied, "to consult on a matter involving disputed patents and, rather ironically, optical devices." I laughed. "The world insists upon its symmetry." Holmes folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. "The world insists upon repetition. Symmetry is something we impose upon it." That evening, as Holmes prepared his notes and I set aside my medical journals, I reflected upon the strange completeness of the journey we had taken. What began with a pair of broken spectacles had widened into an examination of how truth itself may be bent, obscured, or shattered, and how, with care, it may also be restored. As the fire burned low, Holmes spoke once more, almost as an afterthought. "You know, Watson, I am often accused of arrogance, of believing myself uniquely capable of seeing what others cannot." "And are you?" I asked, smiling. Holmes's lips curved in a rare, self-deprecating expression. "Not uniquely, merely unwilling to accept blurred vision as inevitable." He reached for his violin at last, and the melody that followed was neither somber nor triumphant, but quietly resolved. And so, the case of the broken spectacles passed finally into the quiet ledger of memory, not as a tale of a single crime solved, but as a reminder that clarity is fragile, truth requires vigilance, and even the smallest fracture, properly examined, may reveal the shape of far greater things. The invitation Holmes had received did not, in the end, detain us long. A brief consultation, a pointed remark or two delivered with surgical precision, and the matter was left to settle along lines already made inevitable by prior disclosures. Holmes returned from it with the air of a man who has closed a familiar door, neither slamming it nor lingering upon the threshold. Summer had now established itself fully over London. The city seemed altered by the light, its harder edges softened, its secrets less eager to press themselves forward. Baker Street, too, wore a gentler aspect. The windows were opened more often, the fire was allowed to die out. Even Holmes's moods, though never predictable, showed fewer of those violent oscillations that accompanied his more fevered inquiries. It was during one such quiet afternoon that I found him seated at his desk, not working, but sorting an activity he undertook only when some internal reckoning had reached its conclusion. Papers were arranged, then discarded. Notes were reread and consigned to the flames. At last, he opened the drawer, where Sir Lionel Harcourt's spectacles lay. He regarded them for a long moment before closing the drawer again. "There is no further use in keeping relics," he said calmly. "They tempt sentiment." "You are not often sentimental," I observed. "No," Holmes replied, "but I am not immune to symbols." He leaned back in his chair and allowed his gaze to wander across the room. The familiar clutter, the scars of past experiments, the violin resting patiently in its case. "This room," he went on, "has seen hundreds of problems pass through it. Most leave nothing behind. A few alter the furniture. Fewer still alter the man." "And this case?" I asked. Holmes considered. "It sharpened an edge already present. That evening, as we dined, he spoke more freely than usual of his earlier years, of the confidence that borders on recklessness, of the ease with which he once believed intellect alone could compel order. 'I was younger when I first met you, Watson,' he said. 'You may find this difficult to believe.' I smiled. Barely. Then perhaps you will also believe that I once thought exposure sufficient, that if the truth were demonstrated clearly enough, the world would realign itself accordingly. And now? Now I know that clarity threatens those who profit from obscurity, Holmes said, and that resistance need not be overt to be effective. There was no bitterness in his tone, only recognition. A letter arrived the next day from Miss Harcourt, brief but warm. She wrote that her uncle's work had been accepted for inclusion in an international symposium, his name spoken now without qualification or controversy. She thanked Holmes once more, not only for uncovering the truth of her uncle's death, but for preserving the integrity of his work. Holmes read the letter twice, then placed it carefully among his papers. "That," he said, "is sufficient." As the weeks passed, the echoes of the case faded entirely from public consciousness. New scandals arose, new tragedies demanded attention. Sir Lionel Harcourt became, in the public imagination, a name attached to a theory rather than a death. Holmes approved of this. "A solved crime," he remarked one morning, "is best remembered for what it prevents, not what it reveals." I found myself, in idle moments, revisiting the earlier stages of the affair, the broken spectacles on the desk, the locked door, the misplaced confidence with which others had accepted simple explanations. It struck me how easily the matter might have ended differently. Had Holmes dismissed that first inconsistency as trivial? "You once told me," I said to him, "that nothing is ever truly trivial." Holmes nodded. Triviality is merely a judgment rendered before sufficient attention has been paid. On a warm evening toward the end of August, Holmes and I sat once more by the open window, the sounds of the street drifting up to us. A violinist played somewhere nearby, his tune imperfect but earnest. Holmes listened for a time, then smiled faintly. "A street musician," I replied. "Passable." "Incorrect," Holmes said gently. "A man learning to listen to himself." I laughed. "You find lessons everywhere." "Because they are everywhere," he said. "Most people simply refuse to look for them." There was a comfortable silence between us, the kind born of long familiarity and shared experience. At length, Holmes rose and closed the window, shutting out the noise of the city. "Watson," he said, "when you write of this case, and you will, despite your protestations, I advise restraint." "Restraint," I echoed. "Do not present it as a triumph," Holmes continued. "There was no villain unmasked upon a stage, no crowd to applaud the revelation. Present it instead as a correction, a slight adjustment that prevented a far greater distortion." "I shall try," I said, "though I cannot promise subtlety." Holmes smiled. "I have learned to account for that." I have learned to account for that. He reached for his violin and began to play not one of his more dramatic compositions, but a simple, measured air, steady and unadorned. As the notes filled the room, I felt a sense of completion settle at last. The case of the broken spectacles had begun as a puzzle of glass and circumstance, and ended as something quieter, more enduring, a demonstration that truth, like vision, depends not only upon sharpness, but upon alignment. When Holmes finished playing, he set the violin aside and extinguished the lamp. "Another day tomorrow," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Another case, no doubt." "Undoubtedly," Holmes said, already turning toward his room. "The world shows no inclination to mend itself permanently." As I prepared to retire, I glanced once more at the desk where the remnants of so many inquiries had once lain. It was clear now, ordered, at rest. And in that stillness, I understood anew the peculiar genius of my friend, not merely in solving mysteries, but in knowing when a matter had truly reached its end. Thus concludes the affair of Sir Lionel Harcourt and the broken spectacles, a case not defined by spectacle or scandal, but by the quiet restoration of focus, achieved through patience, reason, and an unwavering refusal to accept a blurred world as inevitable. The days that followed passed with a serenity that felt earned rather than accidental. Holmes rose early, took his violin down only in the evenings, and devoted himself to those smaller problems that come and go without leaving scars, lost documents, disputed wills, the quiet mischiefs of human folly. I attended to my patients, yet found my thoughts returning often to Baker Street, where clarity had once again been defended without fanfare. It was on an unremarkable morning, bright with late summer light, that Holmes made his final gesture toward the affair which had so long occupied his mind. I entered the sitting room to find him standing before the fireplace, a small parcel in his hand. "Come here, Watson," he said. He unwrapped the parcel to reveal the steel-rimmed spectacles Sir Lionel Harcourt had left him. Holmes held them up briefly, examining them one last time, not as an investigator now, but as a man measuring the weight of a symbol. "They have served their purpose," he said quietly. Before I could reply, he placed them gently upon the grate and struck a match. The flames caught at once, licking along the thin metal until the lenses clouded, cracked, and finally collapsed inward. Holmes watched without expression until the fire reduced them to twisted remnants. "Is that wise?" I asked at last. Holmes turned to me. "Wisdom lies not in preservation, but in knowing what need not be preserved." He stirred the ashes once with the poker, then set the tool aside. The act felt ceremonial, yet not sentimental, a conclusion reached by reason, not emotion. Later that afternoon, as we took tea, I remarked upon the finality of the gesture. "You have destroyed the last physical trace of the case," I said. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I have removed the temptation to revisit it unnecessarily. Memory is sufficient." He sipped his tea and smiled faintly. "Besides, Watson, cases are not kept alive by objects. They persist through their consequences. Those consequences were already evident. Sir Lionel Harcourt's name appeared more frequently in journals, his work discussed with an openness that had once been denied it. The scientific trust that had sought to bind him was now little more than a footnote, its influence dissipated by exposure and quiet resistance alike. Even Frederick Merton, from his diminished circumstances, could do no more than watch as the world moved on without him. Holmes followed these developments with interest, but without attachment. "Events," he remarked, "are like lenses themselves. Given time, they reveal distortions no inquiry could force at once." One evening, as autumn approached and the air grew cooler, Holmes and I sat together in companionable silence. The lamp cast a warm circle of light upon the table, and outside the city moved with its usual indifference. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "do you know why so many mysteries persist unsolved?" "Lack of evidence," I ventured. "Lack of attention," he replied. "People see what they expect to see, and then stop looking." He leaned back in his chair. "Sir Lionel Harcourt expected opposition, but he underestimated how quietly it could be applied. That was his error. Well, thank you for watching, and to like, and yours?" I asked, gently. Holmes smiled. "Believing that all errors are correctable." There was no regret in the admission, only realism. A few days later, Lestrade paid us a final visit regarding the affair, though in truth he spoke little of it. His manner was reflective, his earlier bluster softened by time and experience. "You were right, Holmes," he said at last, "not just about the man, but about the shape of it all." Holmes inclined his head. "That is sufficient acknowledgement." As Lestrade departed, I could not help but feel that a subtle shift had occurred not merely in the resolution of a case, but in the understanding between my friend and the world he so often stood apart from. The final word came, fittingly, from Miss Harcourt. She wrote once more to inform us that a scholarship had been established in her uncle's name, dedicated to independent research, free from patronage or constraint. She thanked Holmes for ensuring that her uncle's vision, literal and intellectual, had not been lost. Holmes read the letter in silence, then placed it carefully among his papers. "A legacy corrected," he said. That night, he played the violin long after I had retired, the notes drifting softly down the hallway, measured, reflective, without flourish. It seemed to me that the music carried the essence of the entire affair. Not drama, but balance. Not triumph, but resolution. When at last the sound ceased, I found Holmes standing once more by the window, gazing out at the sleeping city. "Do you ever wonder," I asked, joining him, "whether the world notices these small corrections?" Holmes shook his head. "It is better that it does not. Notice invites resistance. Quiet change endures." He turned away from the window and reached for his coat, as though the thought itself had concluded. "Come, Watson," he said lightly. "Tomorrow will bring its own distortions." And so it did. New clients, new puzzles, new fragments of truth waiting to be aligned. Yet for me, the case of the broken spectacles remained distinct not for its cleverness alone, but for the lesson it impressed upon me more deeply than any before. That truth is rarely shattered all at once. More often, it is weakened by careful hands, distorted just enough to pass unnoticed, and that the task of restoring it does not always end with exposure or arrest, but with patience, restraint, and the courage to accept imperfect victories. Thus ended the affair not with a final revelation, but with a quiet understanding shared between two men in a London sitting room. That clarity, once achieved, must be protected not by spectacle, but by vigilance. And that, even in a world content with blurred vision, there remain those unwilling to stop looking until the lines come sharply into focus. Such was the conclusion of the case of the broken spectacles, and such, I suspect, will always be the work of Sherlock Holmes. The matter might well have ended there, and indeed for most men it would have done so. Yet for Holmes, whose mind required not merely closure but coherence, one last evening remained before the affair could be laid fully to rest. It was a quiet night, the sort London offers only rarely, when even the city seems inclined to reflection. Holmes and I sat opposite one another, the fire reduced to embers, the room lit by a single lamp. No papers lay upon the table, no instruments were in use. The absence itself felt deliberate. "You have not yet asked me," Holmes said at last, "the one question that truly completes the case." I looked up. "I had assumed you had already answered everything of importance." Holmes smiled slightly. "Answered, yes, but not stated." "And what is it I should ask?" "Why Sir Lionel died that night." I considered this. "Because Merton accelerated the alterations. Because the confrontation with Vale forced his hand." "Those are the mechanics," Holmes replied. "Not the reason." He leaned forward, his voice low but precise. "Sir Lionel died because he chose to act alone." I frowned. He trusted his own reasoning. "Exactly," Holmes said. "A habit encouraged by genius." He suspected manipulation, confirmed it scientifically, and intended to confront power armed only with proof. He believed accuracy would protect him. And it did not. "No," Holmes said softly, "because proof challenges interests, and interests respond not to reason, but to threat." He rose and paced slowly, as he had on the very first morning of the case. "Merton did not intend murder. That much is clear. But he did intend control. When Sir Lionel ceased to be controllable, the outcome became irrelevant." I felt a familiar weight settle upon me. Then Sir Lionel's final error was moral rather than scientific. Holmes stopped and turned to me. His final error was believing that seeing clearly is the same as being safe. The fire crackled faintly. Outside, a carriage passed, its sound fading into distance. "And yet," I said, "his work survived. His name is honored. The machinery that constrained him was damaged, if not destroyed." Holmes nodded, "Which is why the case is not a tragedy." "Watson, only a cost." He returned to his chair. "Let us place the pieces clearly, once and for all." He spoke then with the calm authority I had so often heard at the end of his greatest cases. Sir Lionel Harcourt was being subtly incapacitated through minute alterations to his spectacles. Alterations introduced gradually, plausibly, and with the intention of undermining his confidence and independence. Edwin Vale was maneuvered into the role of visible suspect, encouraged to make adjustments, drawn into disputes, and left to appear both resentful and careless. The missing document was planted to sharpen that illusion. Merton, Holmes continued, believed himself insulated by distance and influence. He expected Sir Lionel to falter slowly, to withdraw, perhaps to be declared unfit. What he did not expect was resistance. When Sir Lionel verified the interference and sought external confirmation, the timetable changed. Increased distortion led to neurological shock. Sir Lionel collapsed while alone, wearing spectacles he knew to be dangerous but necessary to his proof. Afterward, the lenses were broken deliberately to suggest violence and deflect inquiry toward crude explanations. The locked room, the false trail, the staged inconsistency, all were designed to keep attention shallow. Holmes folded his hands. They failed because violence leaves patterns and manipulation leaves intent. Both can be read. He fell silent, as though that final articulation had sealed the matter irrevocably. After a moment, I said, "And you? What part did you play beyond solving the crime?" Holmes regarded me steadily. I ensured that the distortion did not persist, that Sir Lionel's work remained intact, and that the method used against him could not be quietly reused. "In other words," I said, "you corrected the lens." A faint smile crossed his face. "Precisely." The lamp guttered, and Holmes reached out to extinguish it. Darkness settled comfortably about the room. As I prepared to retire, I paused at the door. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe the world learned anything from this?" He considered before answering. "The world rarely learns. Individuals do. That must suffice." I nodded, satisfied. Years later, when I look back upon the many cases I have recorded, some dramatic, some violent, others merely curious, I find that this one endures in my memory with uncommon clarity. Not because of a brilliant disguise or a sudden confession, but because of its restraint, because it demonstrated that the most dangerous crimes are not always those committed with bloodshed, but those that seek to bend truth quietly, until resistance seems unreasonable. Sherlock Holmes did not emerge from the affair of the broken spectacles as a conqueror, nor even as a hero in the popular sense. He emerged as what he had always been, though perhaps more consciously so: a custodian of clarity, standing watch in a world content with convenient blur. And if, in the end, Sir Lionel Harcourt's death served to sharpen that vigilance, if it reminded one great mind, and through him many others, that truth must be defended as carefully as it is discovered, then his final experiment was not in vain. For as long as men prefer easy vision to accurate sight, there will be need of those who question the lens itself. Such was the conclusion of the case. And such, I have no doubt, will always be the work of Sherlock Holmes.